All right. Mary, thank you so much for joining me on The Same Drugs. I'm looking forward to talking with you.
Thank you for having me.
I have way too many questions for you.
Uh-oh.
So they're not bad questions. It's because I've been reading your book and uh there's so much good stuff in there and so many things that came up for me. I think in some ways our histories are fairly similar, in other ways not so much, but um I think we were you born in 79?
Mhm.
Yeah, so we were born in the same year.
Hmm.
And one of the major differences that I noticed was that you got into the internet right away, and I
Hmm.
absolutely did not.
Huh.
I don't think I started really using the internet until, I don't know, like MySpace.
Huh.
But you were involved long before then. And I thought that was pretty interesting because it seems that where you started is in a lot of ways where we've ended up as a culture and where the younger generations are, which, in various different ways. But in your book, you describe like sort of being able to be someone else.
Hmm.
You described a feeling of like finding your tribe, and then, yeah, you could almost live like a little bit of a fantasy.
Yeah, it
Um,
was. Well, I didn't really like being a teenager. I think that's true of a lot of people, but I mean, I was a nerd. Um, Most of my classmates were not. I, that's enough, really. It's the 1990s. Everybody's into clothes and just being normal. And I was reading Nietzsche in the bath and kind of having complicated thoughts and just generally not being happy with life or myself or having a body or just anything really. And yeah, I was a nerd, an extreme nerd, and it was just yeah. The moment I met the internet for the first time, I got what it was for. And it wasn't just, the boomers all think they still just think it's like a big library that sits somewhere invisible, and that's all you need you can just go and borrow books from the library and or send each other letters, and this is great. And they don't get that it's something else altogether. It's a way of moving more of yourself away from physicality. And, where previously if I wanted to get away from being embodied, I had to go and read a book, and that's just by definition a solitary thing to do. Um, the internet just does something different altogether. It means you're not just doing the reading in the world of ideas. You're doing a lot of the discussion as well, and a whole lot else besides. And yeah, I think I guess I've been extremely online for 20 years,
yeah.
for better or for worse. I guess that's given me plenty of time to think about the downsides of that as well as the upsides. But in that time, I've seen a lot of people follow a similar path towards finding ways to create selves for themselves, which just are only tenuously connected to the physical realm. And I guess, for me, the big moment of revelation with that came a little bit after my first encounter with the internet in the late 1990s. It was sort of early to mid noughties, by which time, still a relative minority, but enough people had got what it was for that message boards were a thing. And I was very involved in a now defunct lesbian message board, which was mostly centered around London, so it still had a fairly strong connection to place. I mean, it wasn't exclusively; there were members from all over the world, but it was more London based than not. Um, and there was a kind of subculture within a subculture on the message board, which was very genderqueer, in a way which is, as far as I can make out, pretty much eaten kind of gay and lesbian culture since, but it was very much a fringe thing at the time. Um, and it was so interesting because it was in that space, people had selves that were as much virtual as they were real. We had a regular night that we'd meet up at in this pub, and people would kind of bring their virtual fantasy selves with them, but the everyone and politely ignore the difference between who they were in an embodied sense and who they were on the internet. And that was just kind of part of the game, and it felt very playful and very, very liberating, genuinely liberating. A lot of these were, they were all women, they were all female, I should say. Most of them, almost everyone I know from that scene now, who identified as who created a masculine virtual self for them, has subsequently transitioned. Almost my entire everybody I know from that time is no longer identifies as a woman.
That
I
is
just watched
so
them.
interesting.
For a while after it happened, Meghan, I was like, pretty much every woman I've ever dated now calls themselves a man. Was it something I said? But I've come to think that it wasn't me. I mean, it wasn't me at all. It was just a thing which was happening. And to be honest, I don't blame butch women who do that. I honestly don't. It's a very difficult social space to inhabit, being a very masculine woman, and just that being the way you're comfortable being in the world. And I honestly don't blame them for just wanting to kind of tip the scales a little bit more and just not get the side eyes in the toilets anymore. I really don't. Even though I think butch women are beautiful and always have done. I think it's a terrible shame. But actually, the first time anyone ever called me a TERF, and this was long before I ever thought of myself in that light, it was the then editor of a very well-known British lesbian magazine, with whom I was doing a psychotherapy course. And at the time, we were talking about gay and lesbian identities, and I expressed my ambivalence. This was some years after I'd left the London lesbian scene, and I expressed my real ambivalence about the fact that pretty much every woman I'd ever dated had subsequently gone through gender transition. And she called me a TERF, and I was like, I don't blame these people for doing what they've done, but I just feel sad because they were beautiful, and I don't even know if I have a right to say that or express that, but that's how I feel. And she called me a TERF, and that, a lot of thought is downstream of that little exchange. I've often wondered what I should have said, but anyway.
Well,
yeah, I think so much of that, in my observation, it wasn't, there are social and cultural pressures there as well, but the internet was a real accelerant. Being able to create a self for yourself virtually was just this insane accelerant for people for whom being embodied was difficult anyway.
Yeah, and I thought this was interesting when I read it in your book, and now even more so since you've told me this about all these people, these women who had masculine personas online, or whatever you want to call it, having transitioned, because I think that it seems as though there's a huge part of internet culture now that's connected to this. I can have I can be a whole different person on the internet, which of course means I can be a whole different sex on the internet. And I think for a lot of young people, that does mean trans identity and potentially transitioning.
Yeah, well, I guess, one of the thought processes I've gone through and trying to make sense of how we've ended up where we are is thinking, well, I mean, you and I are similar age, and we remember the before times, before what James Poulos calls the digital catastrophe, which at some point in the book I called it the real singularity. The transhumanists are fond of saying, oh, at some point in around 2030, humans will meld with machines and will just become one sort of giant super intelligence. And I'm like, that already happened. That happened in 2007 when when iPhones went endemic. The merger of human culture and digital culture that's a done deal. That's like 15 years in the rearview mirror now. The singularity already happened. But one of the things I've tried to make sense of is, what would it be like if you didn't remember the before times? Because that's pretty much everyone younger than us now, isn't it? Or I mean, to an ever increasing extent.
I think
anyone younger than 25 just has no recollection of a time before, doing at least some of your interaction online. And I'm thinking, under those circumstances, you would just take it for granted that being able to be your digital self, to be able to approximate your embodied self to your digital self, would be a matter of basic, simple justice. It's not this isn't some some absurd limit which you're an idiot for trying to pursue. This is a matter of simple justice because you've been interacting in this form since you're a child. So I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised that they look at older people and just particularly older women, in whom the person of the mother, the forbidding mother, or is just the figure of the older TERF has sort of become kind of everybody's mum who says, no, you're not allowed to do that. You have to put the phone down and go to bed, and imposes limits, and that's just outrageous. And so you get this very complicated, very, very, forgive me, infantile rage that gets directed at anybody who says, no, actually, you can't do this. And it's not my fault you can't do this. This is just, I don't make the rules on this. This is just how things are.
Yeah, I mean, there's people become very defensive and, irate in a lot of ways when I criticize first dating apps, but also pornography. And, to me, dating apps, and it's not just because of my age, because a lot of people who are the same age as me get angry at me when I make these criticisms. I think it has become the norm for almost everybody, of course, especially the younger generations, but everyone my age too. This is just how you date. This is how you meet people. And to me, there's so many, really gross things about dating apps. First of all, I don't, I'm in a relationship now, but when I have been single, like, I don't enjoy swiping through people's faces. This is not how I'm interested in meeting somebody. That's not how I connect with people. I connect with people in real life. I think that's a healthier way to connect with people because often the people that you're meeting in real life are connected to other people that you know. You can read their body language. You can make eye contact with them. You can have a real conversation with them. You can see what they actually look like. It's completely normal and accepted for, of course, women, specifically young women in particular, to put filters on everything they post online. Like most of these photos of these young women don't look like how they look in real life. And people are just aghast. And I think it's become so much a part of people's lives and so accepted. It's like, this is where you meet people. This is where you, this is where you start relationships. This is where you work. This is just, it's so integrated. Thank you. Integrated. I could say it's too late for me, but I'm nocturnal, so I don't have that excuse. In people's lives. And I'm curious to know what you think about the whole dating app aspect of relationships. I mean, do you think that they're as toxic as I do?
Well, to be honest, they slightly passed me by. I mean, I've been on the shelf for 10 years. I mean, well, longer than that, but I've been married for 10 years. So, I mean, the whole Tinder Grindr phenomenon wasn't even really a thing when I met my husband. But I'm possibly about to say something radioactive, but this is a thesis that I've been speculating on about the Me Too phenomenon, which describes, I think of as a fairly unavoidable dynamic between men and women. Like, sex happens, power is sexy, and like those situations where attractive young women are around powerful men are always and forever going to be dangerous because they always have been, right? So that's my sort of baseline premise. And my theory is that a lot of the Me Too anxiety and anger, and also a lot of the kind of related anger about so-called street harassment, is downstream of dating apps, because people are no longer habituated to encountering sexual tension in the wild. It's just not normal anymore. Like, I mean, I can remember the before times, and I can remember sometimes being approached by a horny stranger on the street. I didn't love it then, and I'm middle-aged now, so it doesn't happen now anyway. But that's just something, for better or for worse, that you learn to navigate. And if dating apps are a thing, it just doesn't. It takes that entire, in a sense, you only ever encounter sexual tension, or you've become accustomed to the idea that you only ever have to encounter sexual tension in a situation which has been sort of pre-tagged with the possibility of sexual tension.
Mm.
You're only ever flirting with people with whom you've already kind of pre-agreed by virtue of having arranged a date with them that flirting might be a possibility. And there's never ever that moment of finding yourself talking to a complete stranger on a bus or some random location where suddenly you realize they're looking at you in that particular way, and you get that feeling. And I think there's a huge amount of anxiety, particularly for women, because they're every woman, from puberty onwards, knows what it's like to be the object of male sexual attention, like in that way. And it's I think if you're just not accustomed to that, it's frightening. And and when you meet men who have no boundaries, it's frightening in any case. But I think dating apps have actually made that worse, because they've sort of colonized it and turned it into an industry in a sense.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, dating apps are very much connected to pornography, not just in the way that women have to self-objectify, and it's just a very superficial means of interacting
Well,
with
you're sort
somebody.
of turning yourself into a product listing on Amazon, aren't you? I mean, I've done digital marketing. I did various pretty much every sort of marketing there is, and I've spent time uploading products on Amazon and whatever. You're packaging yourself in you use exactly that mindset when you create a dating profile. As you say, you have to self-objectify everybody, not just women, but inevitably, particularly women. And you have to think of yourself as a product in order to stand out from the crowd. So I sort of feel like the difference between that and OnlyFans is a difference of degree rather than kind. The hinge moment is the arrival of dating apps as such, not the arrival of OnlyFans. That just introduced a checkout stage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. Do you identify as a feminist?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I still care about women's interests, and I still think they're often sidelined. I've just had a lot of questions since my late 20s about what constitutes women's interests.
Yeah, I think that, so I think we've had sort of a similar trajectory in terms of our feminism and criticisms of feminism. I mean, one of the things that I found interesting that you wrote about was the appeal of the appeal of getting rid of gender, sort of from I never was super into Judith Butler when I was in college/university, partly because I think she's a really bad writer and I could never really understand what she's talking about.
Only the Academy could
Yeah, and I think they're all lying. I don't think anybody could understand her.
Yeah, the ultimate superpower now is to be able to do theory in plain English, and almost nobody can. When you meet somebody who can, it's absolutely just radioactively powerful. But Judith Butler is not one of them.
No, but I mean, I did spend a long time as a young adult and probably into part of my 30s, my early 30s, thinking that gender was entirely a social construct, and the idea of getting rid of gender entirely, or like gender fluidity kind of thing, was interesting and liberating. And it wasn't until relatively recently that I realized that was not really realistic and maybe not so desirable.
Yeah. I think it's an appealing fantasy. The idea that gender is a social construct is an appealing idea, because it suggests that we could just somehow magically do away with a lot of things which are genuinely often frustrating and annoying. To be perceived differently based on physical attributes that you can't really do anything about is genuinely, in some situations, frustrating and annoying. And that goes both ways, but I think women are probably more at the sharp end of it than men, for all manner of complicated reasons. So yeah, I mean, I can see why people wish that it could be done away with, particularly when you get into the violent or degrading ways that women are perceived differently to men just by virtue of physical features they didn't choose. However, it's an appealing fantasy that, in my view, only holds because of how technologically advanced we are generally. It's an illusion based on living in a high-tech society. The fact that you could even imagine it possible to do away with that gender could be a social construct is itself a social is itself downstream of technologies which make it possible to live as though there are no differences between men and women. I mean, if you take away all the labor-saving devices and you stick everybody back into agrarian work, and you'll see men's work and women's work emerging pretty much instantaneously. And I mean, even within a high-tech society, it's only really possible to imagine that gender is a social construct if you do the kind of work which involves driving a spreadsheet or pushing paper. There are no campaigns for trash collection to have greater female representation. There's a reason for that. You watch those guys working, and it's hard, and you have
There's
to
not
be
a lot of women trying to get onto the oil rigs.
Right, there's not a lot of women trying to get onto the oil rigs. There's not a lot of women trying to get into trash collection, and because that work is physically arduous. I see the guys coming down the street with behind the bin lorry, and they're ripped because they're running behind a lorry that's moving at sort of 4 miles an hour constantly, and they're dragging these heavy objects around. And there might be a few women who could do that, but would they want to? Probably not if they could avoid it, I imagine. So there's this real kind of unspoken sort of class element to the idea that we could just do away with gender, that completely ignores just how many physically arduous and often dangerous jobs are done by the sex which is almost always stronger. And there are plenty of aspects of male sexed difference which the gender critical feminists are fonder of talking of. But I think the fact that men are also more likely to be violent, and then all manner of other things. But yeah, I think physical strength is a factor in manual work, which means that imagining that you could do away with the differences between the sexes is a luxury belief, as Rob Henderson would say.
Yeah,
it signals your upper class status, imagining that you could do away with it.
Yeah, I've read some of his stuff, and I think that it's quite good. And what you were just saying, and this idea of sort of doing away with the idea of gender seems like an elitist belief, which sort of flies in the face of, I always rejected that accusation that feminism was this bourgeois politic. But in a lot of ways, modern feminism is. I mean, it's sort of not rooted in reality all the time anymore.
Absolutely. One of an interesting vignette in a book by a great friend of mine, Erika Bakioki, who's a legal scholar. I think really serves to underline this. I wish I could remember the specifics of it, but it was a court case in the early 20th century. It was a legal battle in one of the states over whether or not there should be sex-specific workplace regulations, and there were feminists on both sides of the argument. And this is what I find so interesting. There were on one side there were feminists who were looking at the situation of working class women in factories and saying, well, of course we need different regulations in the workplace for men and women, because women are less physically strong. They need more breaks. Sometimes they get their periods or they get pregnant. And, if you're talking about working on an assembly line for 12 hours a day, you have to protect women differently because on average they just are different. And on the other side, you had feminists who were looking at the situation of bourgeois women, perhaps more like themselves, in an office context, and saying, no, we absolutely cannot have different regulations for men and women, because that will structurally disadvantage women in knowledge work. That will disadvantage women in the workplace because they'll be discriminated against, because everyone will assume they're less able to do a desk job, which ought to be, where they ought really properly to be treated the same. And it was the bourgeois side. It was that side that won, which I think is a story that's been repeated in slightly different contexts again and again and again since. There are women who are feminists who are looking at the embodied situation of people in context, men and women in contexts where material reality can't be avoided, lose out again and again and again to people, men and women, to feminists who exist in contexts where materiality can be avoided, and one of the subtexts to sort of internal struggles within feminism is really about a much bigger picture phenomenon, which I think is played out all over the world in political contexts, which will well beyond feminism, which is kind of like a victory of the virtual, of idea over physicality, and of people who work with materiality, the defeat of people who have to work with the material world by people who just work with ideas, if you like, the sort of financialization of everything. And when you apply the same sort of dematerialization dynamic to feminism, you get this idea that actually biological sex is a social construct, and we can just dissolve it by saying so, and material reality doesn't work, and which is fine, perhaps, if you work in a museum or you're in a university administration, because the guys you're around are probably fairly well behaved and relatively unlikely to be sex offenders. But it's a whole other ballgame in prisons, which is it's a context that you and I will be very familiar with, having tracked this issue for a number of years.
Yeah. And I mean, there's obviously another way where women and men are quite different. And I think that you write about this in your book also, the way that having a baby really changed your feminist politics.
It did. I think that my belief that gender is a social construct just hit the wall at that point, and a lot else besides. My whole liberal paradigm pretty much hit the buffers at that point, because this is a paradigm that we've taken more or less for granted, increasingly since the beginning of the modern era, which asserts that separateness is the default condition of people, and that what a person is, as a sort of basic premise for everything that we do and everything that we seek and desire as the good, is everything that we are is radically separate to begin with. I mean, this goes all the way back to Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau. But it's just less possible to be that if you're a woman, or certainly it's less possible to be that if you're a mother than it is if you're a man. And Rousseau kind of said the quiet part out loud all that time ago. He explicitly excluded women from his vision of liberal personhood. He thought we should just be kind of charming and compliant support humans. We should be there to kind of look pretty and raise the babies and let the real people get on with personing. Obviously, women have had plenty to say about this since, and a lot of the trajectory of feminism since has been about saying, no, hang on, we get to be, women are people too. That's a common phrase that you hear amongst women in the women's movement, is say, no, this is obviously we're people too, and how dare you suggest otherwise or imply otherwise. But the trouble is, if you're asserting that women are people, and your basic paradigm for what a person is radically separate, then what in effect you end up doing is making mothers invisible, at the level of your metaphysics, at the level of your philosophy. Because the moment you become a mother, you're just not a person in that way. Because you're just not separate from your baby in that way. And pretty every mother I've ever spoken to will tell you this. I got a beautiful email yesterday from a mum who, I'm trying to think how she put it. The way she described it is, she said it's like if one of your internal organs is suddenly separate from you, but it's completely, you can't not take care of your internal organs. It's an existential necessity. So when your baby is hungry, it's not like, oh yeah, I want to look after my baby, or oh, I love my baby. It's more basic than that. It's like this is a part of my body, and I will die if I don't look after it, because it's a part of my body. And that's, I mean, the only time I've ever crashed a vehicle in 2 decades of driving was when my baby was screaming in the back because she was hungry, and I just couldn't think. It's a and going through that experience, having pretty much bought into the whole, to be a person is to be atomized, to be a person is to be autonomous. That's what being a person means. Then to find myself just not quite a separate person from this little dependent infant, it completely scrambled everything that I thought was true. And I thought, well, if this is what it's like being a mother, and that means if being a mother means not being a person in that sense, then how, if feminism has taught me that to be a person is to be autonomous, but now I find I'm a mother, I no longer seem to be a person in that way. What does that imply about what feminism is telling us about motherhood? And that kind of sent me down, from there I ended up down a whole series of rabbit holes about the blind spots within the women's movement. And having kind of scouted around the sort of pop feminism, magazine feminism, and found nothing really to counter what I was seeing, I ended up going further back and thinking, has this always been true? And actually it's not. If you go back to the 19th century, which is a very underrated period in the women's movement, I started looking at what women were saying there about what it meant to be, about what being a woman was, and even pre the suffragettes, there's this incredibly rich history of women trying to engage with what it means and to advocate for women's interests. And from there, I came to the conclusion that we're looking at the whole history as things stand from where we are now. We're looking at the history of feminism on the other side of a victory, an ideological victory that's so total that it's almost impossible to conceive of what happened before then in terms other than those that have been set by the victors. It's like if you imagine the other side had won World War II, we'd look at all the events prior to that completely differently because the winners would have written a different history book. And I came to think that's what I was looking at in the history of feminism, was an entire historiography that had been written by one set of victors. And from there, I came to the conclusion that up until about the 1960s, there'd been this real back and forth between the feminism of care and the feminism of freedom. And these were two poles in women's experience and what women were trying to advocate for in what constitutes women's interests, which had emerged out of material changes that came with the Industrial Revolution, which just completely transformed family life, so that work and home no longer happened in the same place anymore, which posed very specific problems for women. Like, if what you're doing is producing food and tending to animals and maybe weaving, processing raw materials into goods for the family in a medieval productive household, work and family are pretty much the same thing. You're economically active, but you can be a mum at the same time because it's all just the work, right? But when work leaves the home and it becomes something that happens in a factory or an office, that's just not possible anymore. And there were so many, and women had to, family life had to adjust, and that threw up political problems for women. Because on the one, they had less economic agency in, as housewives in a context where they couldn't own property and they couldn't divorce and they no longer had any economic leverage because they weren't directly productive. So in situations where their husbands didn't treat them well, it was a problem. So, and that set off the whole, the demand for property ownership and the demand for the franchise, and, all of which was totally justified at the time. Because they found themselves with a set of legacy cultural and legal structures which just no longer fit where bourgeois women in particular found themselves, and so of course they responded with political mobilization, and rightly so. But then on the other side, there were also bourgeois women who thought actually what ought to happen was a defense of the domestic realm. So maybe like economic productivity had drained from domesticity, but care was still important. Children still needed looking after, and so you get this whole cult of domesticity, as it's contemptuously called by the side that won in this argument, the historiography that you read more recently of 19th century women. But I see the cult of domesticity, the cult of the bourgeois housewife, is straightforwardly a type of feminism. It's just a subtype of feminism which doesn't read as such now, because we don't think of the home as something that could be a site of feminist of value for women. That's almost unthinkable now.
It's not viewed as a place where you can gain power or status.
No. Quite the opposite. And I completely internalized that when I was young. It was unimaginable to think of yourself as, to say, oh, I want to be a mum when I grow up, is just To say I'm a feminist and I want to grow up to be a mum, people would be like, what? Just what? That makes no sense.
Yeah.
And I'd say that's probably still true.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly internalized that. I did grow up thinking that being a mother was oppressive, that being a wife was oppressive, that, I never wanted to have kids, and I still don't want to have kids. And I'm very happy, and I've noticed that there is a sort of trad wife / conservative / anti-feminist backlash right now that says that women who claim that they don't want kids or are happy without kids are lying, and they actually are empty inside. And that's not true for me, but I also realize that, of course, the reality is that most women do want kids. Like the vast majority of women do want kids. And
I think the tradwife. Well, the one thing I'd say about tradwives is that they're nowhere near trad enough. They're not trad. The problem with tradwives is they're not trad enough. What they want to do is go back to bourgeois 19th century domesticity, and we don't live in the industrial era anymore, so that's just not going to happen. So it's just kind of, and I think they should be going considerably further back, not to like the 1950s or the 1850s, but something more like the 1450s, where women where women and men work together in productive households. And actually, for all that I'm quite down on technology in a lot of ways, remote working actually makes that possible now, for some people at least. And I think for those people who can do that, it's a worthy goal to try and bring family life and economic life back together. And I know of families where both partners work and they have kids, and they balance spending time with kids around, a portfolio career that's partially home based, and that seems to me to be a totally workable and really potentially thriving way to do family, which just isn't tradwife as such at all.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I mean, the reality is, of course, that women do want to be around babies, and there was this part of feminism that said women actually don't want to be like straddled with babies. Like they want to have the baby and then they want to get right back to work. And I don't think that most women want that. I mean, it's bad for the baby, it's bad for the mom. Like
in my observation, that's almost never true. I mean, there have always been some women who don't want kids, right? That's observably true even before the industrial era. If you look at the convents in the Middle Ages, I wish I could remember the source, but I found a statistic which suggested that actually a significant proportion of these women came from the upper classes. And my hunch is that these were bookish women who just preferred the life of the mind. And they realized that they had a straight choice between the life of the mind and being able to read books and be left alone, and being a mum. And they were like, if that means I have to give up sex, then whatever. I'm just going to go. You send me, pack me up, and I'll go and be a woman of God. And it's another. It's maybe not an ideal solution from a modern perspective, but if actually all you want to do is like do botany, then in the 1450s, it's probably it's probably your best option. So yeah, I mean, I certainly don't think it's the case that the only archetypes available to women are like maiden, mother, and crone. I mean, you've got priestess and witch but the priestess archetype is not a maternal one. There are countless others too, and I think we have to make space for that, and we have to honor that. But the demographics which I'm interested in is like the slippage between the number of children women say they want to have and the number of children women are actually having is a very sad slippage, because consistently women say they want 2+ kids, and consistently women are not having 2+ kids, and some of them get all the way out the other side of their fertile years, having never planned not to have kids. And I think while we absolutely need to honor those women who are just not up for it. There's also a subset who end up not becoming mothers, who for whom that's very painful. And I mean, just anecdotally in my immediate social circles, it becomes pretty obvious from your mid-30s onwards that if you know a mother who has only one kid who's like school age, you don't ask them nosy questions about when they're having another one, because usually that's a sore point.
Yeah, I have the same experience. I think that's partly because I came from an urban area where people are not religious. And I think those kinds of communities are places where women tend to wait a lot longer to get married and have babies. And the sad truth is that women have been told that they can wait. And that's
it's not true.
not true.
It's not true. I wish I'd got started sooner. I feel blessed to have reached escape velocity at all. Given how completely just not in that place I was in my 20s, and how totally sketchy just everything about me was in my 20s. I feel very fortunate to have ended up in a stable, happy home with one child. But I often wish I'd started sooner.
How was your story?
She's 6.
She's 6. And I'm curious to know how your views of relationships and marriage has changed. I mean, did you start off, when I was younger, for most of my adult life, like honestly, until maybe 2 or 3 years ago, I was very anti-marriage. And I thought that marriage was inherently a patriarchal institution. I'm not particularly interested in marriage, so it didn't really matter to me that much personally, but I was judgmental of women who got married. And, now I could kind of go either way. Again, it doesn't really matter that much to me, but I don't see it as like an inherently oppressive space.
No, I don't think marriage is inherently impressive. I mean, it's an institution whose meaning has changed a number of times over the millennia that we've had it. I mean, I'll say explicitly that I won't talk about my own marriage because it doesn't just belong to me. It belongs to my husband as well, and his privacy is a big part of respecting his privacy, and his boundaries is an important part of playing my part in that relationship. So I'm very sparing about details from my own relationship, but for me personally, I found it life-changing. And just I'll paraphrase my cousin, actually, who wrote to me just after we got married, my husband and I, not me and my cousin, obviously. My husband, shortly after my husband and I got married, my cousin, who's a few years older than me, wrote to me and said, "Congratulations, and I'm so happy to hear that you're married." And she described how for her it was such a nice relief. It was like a weight had been taken off her shoulders, and now they'd agreed that was just it. She was like, "Now I can plan. You don't have to think about, oh, if we're going to be together, and can we are we going to do X, Y, and Z? You just know that's it in perpetuity, so you can make long-term plans, and thinking of yourselves as a collective, as a household." And I've come to think from personal experience, and sort of in the light of those very wise words, that the way to think of it is not as something which is either trapping men into being beta-bucks providers like the manosphere imagines, or trapping women into domestic drudgery as the very anti-marriage feminists think. But if you're doing it right, then you go all in, and because you've agreed that it's a covenant, and that's just it in perpetuity, you're a team from there on in, it becomes an enabling condition for a completely different way of living. It's a kind of like, it's a sort of radical human scale communism, like the only form of human scale communism that I think actually works. Where you really can just share everything. And the moment you start treating it as a trade, and this again from every couple goes through this when you have kids, and suddenly you have a third party that depends on you, where you need to work together. If you think of, I did last night and you're going to do this night, it's your turn, and you're not pulling your weight doing this, and you're not, that's a common feature of adjusting to being parents, is going through that kind of tit for tat. And there is nothing more corrosive to that long-term that long-term communism than trying to treat it as a set of transactions where you have to be optimizing, you have to be maximizing your yield from your part of the bargain. The moment you start treating it as a contract in that sense, then the value which is there in it begins to drain away. But if you can get back to just treating it as a genuine kind of all-in micro communism, it's like going through a magic mirror into a completely different world, where you're just not you're in a very fundamental sense, you're not alone anymore. And the precondition for that is a kind of very radical loyalty, which is quite difficult to attain, I think, in the 21st century, when everybody's been taught, for hundreds of years that we're separate by default. And it's very difficult to sustain as well. But if you can, it's life-changing.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you brought up the importance of, I mean, it's, the waves are sort of an imperfect way to describe feminism, but for lack of a better word, first wave feminism, because it's not really taught anymore, like I didn't learn
it's
about...
been cancelled. It's been cancelled in entirety.
Modern, like, young feminists, like the third wave,
they're like, oh yeah, just screw all
trashed
of them.
it. Yep. Yeah, like
screw
it's
all
like
of them.
a bunch
They're all
of
racist.
like rich white ladies. It's nothing. And in fact, it was the best of all the feminist ways. But they don't teach it in school. They don't teach it in university. No. I did women's studies. I did a BA in women's studies and a master's degree in women's studies, and they did not teach that would have been called women's history, right?
Right.
They didn't teach that.
Right. And it's a terrible shame, because, and I think part of the reason they don't teach it is just because it's illegible from the other side of the from the other side of the victory of the feminism of freedom, which took place in the 1960s with the transhuman turn, if you like, the arrival of the birth control pill.
Yeah.
Which just changed everything. The birth control pill, and then the ratchet towards legal abortion, which is about the strongest statement it's possible to make, that freedom is more important than anything. Yeah, certainly freedom is more important than care and the obligations you might have, especially unchosen obligations to somebody who depends on you. If it's so important, if it's that important that sustaining it even justifies destroying the life of the potential life of an unborn baby, then wherever else you stand on personhood and yada yada yada, it's a very, very, very strong statement in favor of freedom over care, and at that point the feminism of care just became something kind of marginal. And out the other side of that magic mirror, pretty much the entire 19th century argument over what women's interests actually are just becomes completely illegible, because you can only see the bits which are about the feminism of freedom, which is sort of Mary Wollstonecraft and definitely Harriet Taylor Mill and definitely Charlotte Perkins Gilman, but the suffragettes, but the entire so-called cult of domesticity becomes illegible as feminism, because that's the feminism of care, and it just looks like patriarchal false consciousness and just propaganda. And it's not. It's feminism
and gender stereotypes.
Yeah, and gender stereotypes, but it's not. It's feminism. It's just a form which has become illegible.
I'm glad that you brought up abortion, because I wanted to ask you about that. I mean, I've been told by pretty much almost every radical feminist, and I've been engaged in feminism and the more radical end of feminism for a long time. I don't actually like identifying as a feminist anymore, because I don't like what that word has become, and I don't like attaching myself to labels in general, because people try to hold you to certain beliefs as a result. But I've been told by, pretty much all radical feminists that you can't be a feminist unless you support abortion, or I should say abortion rights, perhaps. And I do support abortion rights. I honestly think women should have the right to have abortions whenever they like. But I also know many women who either would call themselves feminist or who I view as feminist, certainly not, misogynist, certainly pro women's rights, certainly strong women, certainly women who are not trying to oppress other women, who are pro-life, who do oppose abortion. And I think that's a totally legitimate view. And I'm curious to know what your views are.
Where do I stand? This is something I've really, really wrestled with, because I came very reluctantly to the conclusion in the course of writing Feminism Against Progress that abortion was the metaphysical cornerstone of the kind of radical freedom obsession which has produced, amongst other things, the transgender movement, which has now become a very, very obviously anti-women thing, at least to my eye, and I believe you share my view. You've been cancelled repeatedly for sharing that view
for many years now.
and I came very reluctantly to the conclusion that the hinge moment where that paradigm came to dominate was the legalization of abortion across the West. And I wasn't happy at having come to that conclusion, because I've always, reflexively as a legacy liberal, took the view that safe, legal and rare was the appropriate way to look at it. But I think what my sense increasingly, as I look around and I look at the arguments now, I think what abortion means has begun to change. How do I put this? How do I put this? I really struggled with whether to take a stance and say no, actually it ought to be banned, because it's bad metaphysics, and in practice over time it's becoming increasingly clear that it's very anti women metaphysics. What it does is it entrenches as the cornerstone of women's personhood that kind of the central importance of freedom from unchosen obligations, which structurally disadvantages mothers, which is to say, actually, more women than not. So what you're saying is that the central, you can't be a feminist unless you accept a metaphysics which renders mothers invisible. And I'm like, that makes no sense. I also think it makes no sense to say, well, we ought to be able to flatten the unchosen obligations of our embodied selves in this way, in the pursuit of personal freedom, even at the expense of a radical medical intervention such as ending a pregnancy. But we shouldn't allow other people who identify as the opposite sex to flatten their sexed embodied self differences in the pursuit of personal freedom in that way. We can do it like this because feminism. We can't do it like that because reasons. To me, there's a basic incoherence in being for abortion and against transgender surgeries, because they're from, the one leads directly to the other, in my view. So I've really struggled with this as well. But life is messy, and I think where it comes to pregnancy, this is one of those situations where there are really no good solutions, and you just have to pick which set of trade-offs you want. And what I would like to, the position I came to in the book was to say, I don't stand with those radical pro-lifers who say we should just bring down the ban hammer, because they tried that in Romania under Ceausescu, and we've all seen the photos, we've all seen footage from the orphanages, and just the horrors that came downstream of just bringing down the ban hammer. I think the pill and sexual mores more broadly have changed so fundamentally that even if you banned abortion now, everything without changing anything else, all you would do is just make life hell for women. And I can't stand behind that as a feminist policy. But what I would advocate, and where I think both ambivalently pro-choice and ambivalently pro-life women could possibly come together, is to say, instead of taking radical autonomy, even at the expense of an unborn life, as our paradigm for what women should be aiming for, perhaps we could say, what would it take to create a world where every baby is welcome in conjunction with his or her mother, without that coming at the expense of her personhood? What would it take to create that world? And perhaps we could work together towards that. That might look like better maternity care. That might look like more crisis pregnancy support. That might look like a whole raft of social changes that valorize family life as alongside economic agency as an individual. It's and all of which are laudable feminist goals wherever you stand on abortion. So that's really where I'd like to start. And I think there's so much work to be done on just working towards that world that we can perhaps park the question of a final yes or a final no on the medical procedure until we're considerably further towards that goal.
Yeah, I mean, I think that criminalizing or somehow otherwise banning abortion would just be far too cruel to too many women and girls.
And actually, if you talk to any serious pro-life feminists, they'll agree with you wholeheartedly on that. I mean, Erika Bakayocki, who I mentioned before, is an active campaigner for life. She's also a feminist who comes originally out of the liberal tradition and also a staunch Roman Catholic. And she's very, and if you talk to anyone within that community, the Roman Catholic pro-life feminists, they're absolutely not on the same page as the as the guys who just want, if you like Reaganism with a side order of reproductive sadism,
like you're a murderer and you have to go to jail.
This idea, all we need is, everything should stay the same except what women do, and that means just you're on your own. Personal responsibility, and apart from that, we're just going to have capitalism, and it's all going to be fine. That obviously doesn't work, and is profoundly anti-women. It's obviously the impact of that. Just placing the entire responsibility for what happens for making sure it goes right, and then also the suffering endured when it goes wrong. Because there will always be situations where it goes wrong, or horrors.
Where there's extreme health risks for the mother or baby.
Extreme health risks, or abusive situations. It's yada yada yada. These are all well rehearsed, and placing the entire responsibility for that on the shoulders of often very frail and very young shoulders of women who found themselves in extreme or horrendous situations. That's self-evidently just not a pro-women position to take. And it's very difficult in the extreme for me to reconcile that with the fact that legal abortion is a bad metaphysics, which at scale, in the way it's kind of now being pursued, is producing anti-feminist effects throughout the culture. And it's my heartfelt desire that we can find a way of working towards a less Reaganite with reproductive sadism world, where every baby could be welcome. Without it having to come at the cost of a woman's personhood.
I will say that, despite the fact that I do think that women should have the right to have an abortion when they want to have an abortion, I also think that the pill has been one of the worst inventions ever for women.
Alex Jones is not entirely wrong.
It's horrible health-wise, like physically it's really bad for women, but socially, there's a reason why Hugh Hefner loved the pill.
Right. It's the foundation for all the commodification of women's bodies which has come since, because it's the keystone of privatizing sexuality. Because you can realistically make the case, underwritten by a technology such as the pill that interrupts normal fertility, that sex is nobody's business apart from your own. Whereas previously that just wasn't the case. Everybody around you really did have skin in the game about what you were doing and with who. If you were female, because there was a real material pregnancy risk. And then the pill comes along, and suddenly it's possible for women to have for sex to be treated as a kind of leisure activity. Because that normal condition of fertility has been interrupted, and once it's privatized, it can be commercialized. The two follow hand in hand, absolutely without fail. Wherever something, the moment something is private property, it can be leveraged as a resource for profit. So in the moment sex becomes nobody's business but your own, you have a libertarian defense of the sex industry. You have a libertarian defense of the porn industry, and all the horrors that radical feminists will rightly denounce. The exploitation and the brutalization and the degradation that follows from that. The flip side of freedom is always trade. Can't have one without the other.
Yeah, and it's also, it sells a lie about women, because women don't enjoy casual sex as much as men do. Women don't want to be like men, no matter what some women will say. It's simply not true. And I'm not saying women never enjoy casual sex. I've had casual sex. I know that it can be fun, but I also know that there are way different implications for women in terms of having casual sex. And I think for the most part, women do get more emotionally attached than men do. And there's evolutionary reasons for that.
Right. My good friend Louise Perry is excellent on this, and on the ways in which at scale the sexual revolution has been a disaster for women. She points out that the studies suggest that for women for men, a casual sexual encounter, they're most likely to have an orgasm. For women, the likelihood is 10%. Compared to considerably higher, something like 60% in a robust relationship, in a committed relationship. And you just think, so this is a technology which facilitates the commodification of women's bodies in pornography and prostitution, and furthermore, it opens up It makes it very much more difficult to say no to sexual encounters with a 10% chance of orgasm, and it's psychoactive and it makes you fat and mad and sexless. I mean, I speak from personal experience here, right?
Yeah.
I took the pill for a little while in my late teens and early 20s, and after I came off it, I was like, I never want to do that again.
Yep.
That's just
I had the same
that made me
experience.
nuts. That
It
made me
was
completely
like, oh,
insane.
that made me crazy. Cause
Yeah.
yeah, and I went
Yeah.
off of it, when I was like quite young in my early 20s. And then at some point, my doctor pressured me to go back onto the pill because I'd had a miscarriage. And he essentially was like, well, clearly you're too irresponsible and there's no other option. And I was like, no, I don't like it. I don't like how it makes me feel. He's like, well, try this one. It'll be different. It wasn't any different. It was terrible, but it made me feel crazy. Like
it makes you insane.
I was able to tell the difference. It makes you bloated. It makes you put on weight. It makes you crazy. It makes you have no libido. It's completely irrational.
It's horrendous. It's horrendous. And I think there are, one of the most encouraging, interesting phenomena recently is the growing number of young women who are pushing back against the pill. Having been put on it, sort of, I gather from women much younger than me that it's pretty routine now. They just stick girls on the pill at about the age of 15, just as a matter of course. And then some of these young women will get to their 20s and they'll come off the pill and just be like, "What did you do to me? You bastards! What did you do to me?" Because they've just had a complete personality transplant. And just discovered actually who they are, having been on this incredibly psychoactive substance, just so that nobody would have to, so they could be sexually exploited throughout their cutest years without any negative consequences. And they're like, bastards.
And not learn anything about their sexualities in the meantime. First of all, because they're young and they don't really know, but second of all, because their libidos have been messed up.
Right, and there's
and they're having casual sex, which is not likely to give them sexual pleasure anyway.
So they've come out they've come out in their mid-20s, having had sex with however many people, most of which was probably not very enjoyable, and which they probably weren't feeling very horny for anyway. With a wagon load of sexual trauma in their early 20s, realizing that somebody was just messing with their brain, and like, who actually benefited from this? Cui bono here. It's not the girls, and who are pushing back and saying, no, this is just outrageous. I think a feminism against progress, a feminism fit for the 21st century, the transhuman century, starts with a feminism against the pill.
Yeah.
And that's the only way to bring intimacy back into sex is to bring back the danger. And that, I mean, this is not a course I advocate for anyone who has poor impulse control, for obvious reasons. But yeah, I think I make the pro-sex case against the pill, and I'm the pro-sex and pro-intimacy case against the pill.
For sure. I mean, it's not sexually empowering at all. Again, first of all, because of the physical impact, but also, again, because, women, especially young women, should know that casual sex isn't enjoyable. This isn't how you're going to learn about your sexuality.
For most people, no, absolutely not. Sure, there are very loud outliers who have a platform out there, but there are.
You're like, just because we don't have your sexual hang-ups, that's what people say to me all the time.
Right,
like,
right. Actually, on average, no, what Meghan is saying is true. And I'm thinking, how many dodgy sexual encounters would just go ahead and not happen if women had a real material reason to say no? That time when it's the end of the evening and this guy's like, oh, come on, just come back for one last. You'd be like, no, I can see where this is going, and actually, I'm not, and I'm not going to, and I don't want to do that either. And no, I'm just going to go home, and then, really, and then wake up hungover, but considerably less regretful than you would otherwise have been. Yeah, I think, and yeah, I think the route back out of some of the really unpleasant, degrading places that we found ourselves in collectively as a sexual culture begins with women rejecting the pill and rejecting the idea that we're sterile by default.
It's interesting. I'll let you go soon. I know that it's been about an hour now. It seems to me that third wave feminism has mostly offered women a lie. You wrote about polyamory and everything from teaching girls that prostitution and pornography is empowering for them. You know, like it's cool. It's cool to be a sex worker. It's cool to say I'm a sex worker now. I mean, who knows what that means anymore. It could mean all sorts of things from actual prostitution to like, I don't know, selling a nude photo once.
Yeah, I get the impression that most of the people who are, the loud outliers on this tend to be kind of college girls who did cam work once or twice. That it's not the trafficked girls from villages in Romania who end up in the mega brothels in Germany. Those are not the ones who are advocating for sex work is work.
No.
They're the ones who end up on the other side, telling painful stories as survivors and saying, no, actually this needs to be stopped if we can.
For sure. But that's not what third wave feminism has taught young women.
That's not what third wave feminism has taught young women. I mean, like the most charitable read I can give to, the entirety of that sort of social justice mindset is that it's what being idealistic looks like if you've drunk the sort of drunk the neoliberal Kool-Aid so deeply that you can't see any way out of that kind of radical individualism. And actually being idealistic looks like wokeism from that perspective. If you've been mainlining Thatcherism and Reaganism since you were a baby, which obviously anybody in their 20s has. Thatcher came to power the year I was born, God, and so that whole the neoliberal mindset is just it's in the air now, and these kids have never known anything else. So, and if you're a genuinely idealistic person and you want the world to be a better place, that sort of utopian view of what trade could actually be, it makes a messy kind of sense as long as you don't try and map it ever onto actual reality, or use your eyes, or really think about the feedback you're getting when you try these things in practice. As long as you don't do any of those things, it kind of makes sense. But if you do actually have eyes and a capacity to think from observation as well as from principle, it's obviously not true. Humans still can't change sex. We still can't do anything about the fact that we are our bodies. We still can't do anything about the fact that we get older. The filter still isn't my actual face. I just wrote the column that comes out today about this phenomenon last week of all these mostly women looking at themselves on the TikTok teenage filter and crying, which I just thought was an extraordinary moment. Whether they're sort of encountering their younger selves and thinking, where did the time go? But it came immediately after a very sad story about a OnlyFans creator, Diana Dietz, who's also known as Coconut Kitty, who was notorious for altering her online images to appear very much younger. And if you look at the images themselves, they're really eerie, because I mean she's the body is obviously a mature woman, very beautiful, very trim, very large fake breasts, very heavily tattooed. I mean, in my experience, people who have a lot of ink are saying without saying it that actually they find life difficult. That's usually what having a lot of ink means. And so this is the body of somebody who's been around the block, still beautiful, but definitely been around the block. And then you've got this like 15-year-old face on it, and the effect is weird. But yeah, there was it came out in the news about a week ago that she'd taken her own life. And I don't want to speculate, on something that's obviously just a source of, she obviously suffered greatly, and she'll be mourned by the people she left behind, including her kids. She was a mother. But yeah, there's just something so tragic about the whole story, and these images and what she was doing to get by, and the gap between that and obviously who she was in real life. And yeah, it's just such a really awful.
And the idea that this kind of thing is empowering. It's like, I think that if it were actually empowering for you, you wouldn't be pretending to be someone entirely different who you aren't, which is what all women in the sex trade are doing. I mean, it's what they have to do.
Yeah, it's what you have to keep smiling, no matter what it is people are asking for. You've got to keep smiling, and you've got to keep making happy noises.
Yeah, you can't be yourself.
And the idea that there's anything empowering about that, and that it's just the same as like being a hairdresser or I don't know, putting packets through a till in the supermarket, is the most pernicious lie. because it's one thing like going to a workplace, and it's a whole nother ball game when you are the workplace and you're the product, or or indeed, you're the raw materials for somebody else, as in the surrogacy industry. You're the product in the workplace. And I think, what was it? They talk about uterus transplants now. Perhaps we could even be the raw materials. That would just complete the commodification of women's bodies, and turn us just into, something like coal, which can be strip mined.
Yeah. Yeah.
Welcome,
really, really.
welcome to liberation, also known as total commodification. I'm not a fan.
So your book, of course, is Feminism Against Progress. When will it be available in North America? Is it out in the UK?
It's out in the UK today, actually, 2nd of March.
Wow, congratulations.
Yes, it's publication day for me here. It will be available in North America. Publication date is 25th of April. The publisher is Regnery. I'll be over in the US on the East Coast for about a week in New York and DC. Just around the book coming out. Yeah, I'm excited. Also very nervous, as you can imagine. But yeah,
it's super interesting. Like it's an original perspective for sure. I think it's really important to think about everything that you're bringing up. I mean, some of these things like radical feminists have been talking about for some time, and other things I don't know that anyone's been talking about.
Yeah, the cyborg theocracy. Everybody asks me what I mean by that. I'm just like, please just read the book because it's difficult to sum up. But yeah, we've all been cyborgs since we started taking the pill and came to believe that actually our freedom was contingent on making these technologies part of our bodies. I have questions about how feminist it is to be a cyborg. So, like Donna Haraway's observations are correct, but I disagree with her conclusions.
Well, thank you so much for talking with me. It's been super interesting. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and congratulations again on the book.
Thank you. Thank you, Megan. It's been great.
Have a great day.
And you.
Take care.